One of the last things I'll tend to do when I'm working on an image is apply sharpening. Very often, I'll apply that sharpening as the last step as part of my output workflow. In other words, when I'm preparing an image for final output to be printed or shared online. But with old photos that need a lot of work, I'll often apply at least a little bit of sharpening during the workflow process. In other words, during the optimization process for the photo. It's important to keep in mind, however, that sharpening can be a dangerous thing when it comes to older photos, and that's because they tend to lack the detail that sharpening is going to enhance. Sharpening can therefore simply exacerbate noise or grain or other problems in the photo. With this image, though, we have a fairly clean image. We've got a lot of good detail, and so I think sharpening will work just fine. I want to apply some basic sharpening to the original image so that that master image contains some sharpening, but I want to sharpen all pixels in the image. You can see, for example, that I have a background image layer as well as an image cleanup layer. I also have an adjustment layer, but that of course does not contain any pixels, but I want to make sure that the pixels on both the background layer and the cleanup layer, for example, are sharpened. That means I'm going to create a composite layer because I don't want to have to apply sharpening multiple times to all of the image layers for a photo. To create that composite layer, I'll go to the Layers panel and then click on the thumbnail for the topmost layer. I'll then hold the Control, Alt, and Shift keys on Windows or the Command, Option, and Shift keys on Macintosh, and while holding all three of those keys, I'll press the letter N for a new layer and the letter E to merge visible onto that layer. I'm essentially stamping all of the contents of all of the layers below onto this new layer. To keep organized, I'll go ahead and rename this layer, so I'll double-click on the name for the layer. I'll just type Composite as the new name and then press Enter or Return to apply that change. I can now apply sharpening to this layer. I generally use Smart Sharpen, so I'll go to the Filter menu and then choose Sharpen followed by Smart Sharpen. That will bring up the Smart Sharpen dialog, and I can adjust my settings as needed. Generally speaking, I'll want to use a relatively small radius and a moderately high amount. Keep in mind that at this point I'm really just trying to compensate for the overall appearance of the photo. I'm not trying to exaggerate the sharpening for print, for example. I just want to improve the base sharpness for the photo. If I have a high degree of detail, I'll definitely want to use a low radius, generally about 1 pixel or lower, and then my amount will generally be somewhere in the vicinity of 100%. That amount will vary based on the resolution of the image and the degree of detail. In situations where the detail is relatively coarse, in other words, where I don't have a lot of fine detail, where the transitions and contrast occur over a relatively large number of pixels, then I'll tend to use a larger radius setting, generally between about 2 and perhaps 4 pixels. But as a result of that larger radius for the contrast edges, I'll need to reduce the amount somewhat significantly. For this photo, though, I think a radius of right about 1 pixel will work out well. I'll increase the amount just a little bit in order to optimize the effect in the photo. At any time, I can click on the preview image to see the before version without any sharpening, and then release the mouse to see the after version. Note that I'm using the lens blur option for remove, and that's the only option I ever use with Smart Sharpen. The Gaussian blur option will give you the same effect as the unsharp mask filter for sharpening, which is not quite as sophisticated as Smart Sharpen, and motion blur, frankly, is not going to give you a great result because if there's motion blur in the image, it's very difficult to compensate for. So I leave that set to lens blur. In situations where I really want to enhance detail, I could turn on the more accurate checkbox, but with older images, I never do that because that more accurate option is really just going to enhance any texture and other problems within the image that I don't really care about. I don't want to enhance film grain, for example, so I leave that more accurate option turned off. With my settings established, I'll go ahead and click the OK button. Now keep in mind, because I've applied my sharpening to the composite layer, if I later decide that I want to change anything else about the image, I'm going to need to throw away this composite image, make whatever adjustments I need, and then create a new composite layer when I'm ready to sharpen the image again. But I think that's a small price to pay in terms of making sure that our sharpening is applied evenly to all pixels in the photo.